So today we're just going to cover just a brief intro to sports nutrition. So we're not going into too much depth in information here. It's just going to touch on just a brief history of sports nutrition, why it's important, and just give you general guidelines that at least you can take home and think about and starting to incorporate with your athletes, in the short term. For those that don't know me, name's Coach Gavin Mole. That is me there on the right with one of my players. If you happen to see me at the fields, I'm very open to meet new people and come and ask me questions and introduce yourselves from either the Sting teams or the Titan teams. We're all one club, so we just want to help as many people as we can. A bit about my education. I'll let you guys read that in your own time. I just wanted to put it up there just to show you I do have some background in this and qualifications to really help and encourage you guys to improve the performance with nutrition. I just wanted to start with a little quote which basically sums up my goals for this program. Although this is sports nutrition, I want us to think of this as just a way to improve just overall health for our children. It's a very big passion of mine. There will be future presentations in detail about more on the overall state of kind of the nutrition in the country at the minute, and there's a large epidemic, should we say, of child obesity at the minute. So I just wanted to encourage you guys to just read that quote there and just understand that this is to help us perform, but also it's just to help us just live better as well. So. Okay, so a brief history. I've gone back to the 1800s. Dutch swimmers tested caffeine as a source of performance boost to get a great increase of energy. Obviously not a whole source of food, but even way back then, they was testing things to help them get a performance boost, which wasn't to do with genetics or just regular training. We're trying to get an extra benefit from something outside of those factors. In the 1960s, I've jumped ahead quite a bit. Lots of glycogen testing started to happen. So testing carbohydrate loading, effects on endurance performance, things like that. I'm sure you're familiar with Gatorade. In 1965, Gatorade was born out of the University of Florida for the Gator fans on the chat. And again, that's another carbohydrate-based drink, which they started to use to improve performance, but also replace lost water through sweat and things through exercise. In the 1980s, lots of professional organizations, clubs in different sports started consulting with registered dietitians, sports nutritionists to, again, gain an edge over competition, obviously, especially in the elite game, which obviously we hope some of our kids get to at some point. I'm sure they've got goals of that. Very important that they try and get that little bit of extra edge. So they started to use that quite predominantly in the 80s. Into the 2000s, we moved from physiology labs to dedicated sports nutrition labs. So most universities now, I imagine all of them actually, would have dedicated labs purely for sports nutrition and not just for physiology or biomechanic and just the athletic process of it. It's more based around how can we get a benefit from what our athletes take in. So there's lots of studies going on now all around the world. A big one in 2009 in the University of Exeter was a study on beetroot juice. Beetroot is found to produce nitric oxide, which increases your blood flow and muscle contraction. So I don't know of any professional teams that probably don't use this right now. Most teams use beetroot. They give beetroot to their players before games. Certainly the soccer teams. I'm not so up to date on the other sports, but in soccer they certainly use that. And then now it's everywhere now. Like I said, every university has labs, constant testing, always trying to gain an advantage through whole sources of foods like beetroot, or even still the sports drink market and other supplements, which I'm not recommending for the young kids right now. But caffeine is a big one, which obviously even back from the 1800s they started testing it. Performance nutrition, to me, is fuel. So I've got the picture there of the car. Imagine it as a car. Without gas, you aren't going anywhere. Your car's not going to work. So we're fueling daily. And when I say fuel, I'm just talking about food and drinks. with calories, which give us energy to perform. I've put there daily because we want to do it on a daily basis, because if we think we can eat very little during the week and then suddenly carb load before a game, it's not going to work. You need that consistent daily fuel to help us on the games or practices. We fuel to stay healthy and decrease the risk of injuries. Pretty straightforward. The less we eat, especially if we're in like a calorie deficit, the more our immunity changes. We increase our risk for injuries, common illnesses, and things like that. After a performance, we need extra fuel to recover and replace all that we've just lost, the muscle breakdown, the sweat we've lost, we replace it with fluids, etc., etc. And again, importantly, this more is on our everyday life. We don't want to fuel with foods that we're only eating just for performance. Ideally, we want to enjoy the foods that we eat every day. We want to foods that taste good and just that's sustainable. So you're living a good, healthy lifestyle, which is also affecting performance. Is the ideal goal. So there's a few things that influence athletic ability, and I think the most common one, if I asked everybody what you thought, the first answer would probably be genetics. And genetics does play a role. You know, we've got increases in muscle mass, vary between people, fast twitch, slow twitch fibers with the endurance or the speed aspect of it. We have optimal training. Are we doing all the things that we can to improve on our genetics even further? Are we training for speed? Are we training for technique? Are we training for different things that boost our performance? But then the often overlooked one is good nutrition. Without it, as I said before, you're not going anywhere. Your body's not moving. Your body can't last during a sport. And I think it's just often overlooked, and it's just no secret ingredient. And we just need to make sure we're trying to cover all of those bases, as well as the psychological aspect as well, like Rick just gave you some good information on. So if we're not doing that, if we're not eating right, what are the consequences? Obviously, weight loss, strength loss during any sport. You know, we're going to lose a competitive edge if we're weaker. For sure, fatigue will kick in, especially in a calorie deficit. If we're not getting that energy that allows us to have that endurance to compete for the entire game, we certainly need to be looking at that. I just mentioned immunity on the previous slide, so I won't go any further on that one. Soreness and joint pain, again, I'm sure perhaps yourselves maybe been to the gym and you're sore after a workout, and a lot of times most people will think that's just because you've had a tough workout. It's a lot to do with energy and the amount of food you've ate and your recovery, what you've ate before you've been there and after you've been there. It's not necessarily a sign of how hard you've worked. It's more your nutrition. Nutrient deficient, obviously that can lead to all sorts of health problems, very, very simple things, but also skin issues, bone growth development, even dementia, which very serious illness, which I'm sure none of us want or would like any of our family members to ever, happen. And then diminished performance, as we've said there, we're just going to lose performance. So basic energy needs, like what do we need to eat? What's a good amount? There is a guideline. I've put there 15 to 30 calories per pound of body weight. It varies greatly, so it could be less than that. It could be more. It really does depend on your athlete and obviously the age and the climate and how much you're doing. And there's lots of variances. That's just a more simple guide. The graph on the left shows you sort of a seesaw of calories in versus calories out. Obviously, if you stay at your baseline, you won't gain or lose weight. If you're in a calorie deficit, you're obviously going to lose weight. If you eat too much without doing enough energy, you're obviously going to gain weight. Calories expended works off three things. So resting metabolic rate is the amount you burn without doing anything. That just depends on your genetics, how much muscle mass you have, and that's just how much you burn at rest without doing anything. Then we have the thermic effect of food, and different foods produce different amounts of thermic effect, and that can either burn more or less calories depending on what it is. And then we add our physical activity to that, and that really is the thing that changes it an awful lot. If you've got someone doing 5 3-hour sessions a week, or you've got a 10-year-old who only practices twice a week, then obviously it's a different amount of activity completely. So just wanted to give you guys an idea of a rough guide on that. This is just a bit more detailed in terms of the age group, so I won't read through them all. Just I'll give you a second to look at that while I talk. We have 7 to 10-year-olds, 11 to 14, 15 to 18. There's 3 different varied amounts of activity there, to low, moderate to very high. And the first figure in each line is a male athlete, and the second is a female. So you'll see it does differ greatly between the ages and also between the sex. You'll notice the gain is a lot higher for the men than it is for the female when we go through the low to moderate to very high. Any women on the chat here might I know plenty of women who, when they go to the gym to exercise, get hungry straight away, whereas myself, in a male genetic makeup, we don't have that same molecule that's kind of making us want to eat after exercise. I personally could play soccer for 2 hours and would not be hungry at all, whereas it's very different depending on your gender and how our body reacts to that. As you know, we're all unique. So carbohydrates are the main fuel source that we keep talking about here. So I want you to think of carbs as a muscle as a sponge. So I want you to think of a muscle as a sponge, and what I mean by that is if you have a dry sponge, it's not going to work. So we need to make sure that sponge is wet. By wet, I mean plenty of energy, plenty of food inside the body to fuel the carbohydrates that are fueling our performance. Carbohydrates reach the muscles quickly. So depending on the glycemic index, we have fast digesting, slower digesting, but they still reach the body, reach the bloodstream a lot quicker. So that reason they're our primary source of energy during sport. Then we have protein as kind of the next macronutrient, which helps us during our performance. The main responsibility for this is as muscle growth, and we do use it as a fuel source if and when our glycogen stores are low. And then it also, at the end of our workout, it's our main macronutrient for repairing and recovering the muscle damage that's occurred during the sport. Our glycogen stores, there's a limit to them. It's not like fat where you can store unlimited amounts. There is a limit to it, which is why we have to fuel our body throughout the week. We can't just maximize it on a weekend right before a game and expect us to be okay. There is a limit to it, and that's when protein kicks in as well, when that limit gets a bit lower. So a little graph here. This is how a fat and protein diet would affect your physical endurance. So as you can see, 57 minutes, so just under an hour. If you have a balanced diet, 1 hour 14, and a high carbohydrate diet, 167 minutes. As we can see, much higher level of endurance if we're eating a high carb diet throughout the week, and then having carbohydrates around our training or games. That will really help to boost our performance. Fluids and hydration. I wanted to go over hydration in a little bit of detail. We're not going to go into it massively. It's a massive topic, and we'll do further webinars on this. But males and females differ a little bit, but both high percentage of body weight consists of water. And then these are kind of, if you're not hydrated, this is what kind of it affects basically. So cardiovascular function. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about things like transporting nutrients, oxygen. We're removing waste, and we just need to make sure those things exist. So we make, and then thermoregulation. We're just making sure our core body temperature stays at the optimal temperature. We don't want it to get too high or too low. I'm sure we all know the effects if you've been in the sun too long and we've not been drinking, and maybe our body overheats. I'm sure we've all been accustomed to that before. Injury prevention, as I've mentioned before, with the food. Hydration is another big factor in terms of injury prevention. Muscle cramps is a simple one to kind of give you an idea. We've all got cramps before, and a lot of that is to do with hydration, especially in a climate like we live here in Texas. It's very hot, very humid, and we need to make sure our athletes are drinking water enough to prevent that. Recovery, replace those the sweat that is lost, the electrolytes that are lost, the salt that is lost from your body. Fluids or hydration help you to do that. Impaired performance we'll go into on the next slide. There's a little chart here. So if we're not hydrating, there is a greater increase of risk of injury, as I mentioned, and that's due to we will lose muscle strength, speed, stamina, energy, and probably the one that most people don't think about is the cognitive process, and goes along with what Rick was talking about as well. We're looking at things that are really important in soccer. We will lose if we dehydrate. How we think, our perception of our surroundings, obviously very important skill in soccer. Our attention, our focus will decrease because we're kind of in a dazed environment right now, and we're not kind of sure how to focus. Memory loss is another one. We want to make sure that all these things don't happen and make sure we're hydrated. So when should you drink? This is a rough guide. Again, it's very individual. I'm going to keep repeating individual a lot because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach by any means. 2 hours before exercise, you want to be making sure you're taking in a fair amount of water. I've put 400 to 600 milliliters there. 15 minutes before, a little bit less. You don't want to get too bloated, you don't want to cause any stomach upsets right before the game. You want to be good to go. Every 20 minutes during, again, a sort of similar amount, a little bit less. You want to be sipping on drinks and not taking big gulps. You don't want to, anything, like I said, anything to upset your stomach. Post-sport, as mentioned before, we lose a lot of sweat. We need to replace those fluids that we've lost, especially in the hot climates. So 5 ml per kilogram is kind of a guide. I'll let you guys work out your athlete's weight and kind of figure out the amount that you might need for that. Like I said, it does depend on the climate, amount of exercise they're doing, intensity of the exercise, and a lot of things. But it's just again, I just want to give you a guide, sort of take home information that you can kind of put into practice and figure out what's best. What we know, my advice is to don't rely on thirst. As when I'm coaching and I'm doing practices, I'll ask the boys or a coach to go get some water, and the answer is always, "I'm not thirsty, coach." And my response is always, "It doesn't matter. Go drink some water." Especially in the hot summer months, as I said, you can't rely on your perception of thirst. We need to make sure we're drinking. So parents, definitely encourage you guys to not bring just one tiny water bottle to a game for sure. And I know I have a few that do that as well. And it's just not enough water. Drink before, during, and after. As I said, it's small sips. It's drinking regularly, and it's not taking big gulps and knocking down 500 milliliters in one go. After, very important. We'll talk about that in a second. So I've put here, water is fine if you're doing less than 1 hour's activities, and it's not as intense. So if we're just doing practice or we're playing an hour's game for the younger ones, I'm not going to recommend any sort of sports drinks for that age because of the different things that are in there, additives that they put in, the colorings, the tooth decay. It's not ideal for the younger ones for sure. And we only want to be drinking those if absolutely necessary, to be honest. When they are necessary or better for certain age groups, certain levels or in high intensity, there's different ranges of sports drinks. There's multiple different types. A lot of people think they're all the same. It's a very detailed topic, and please drop me an email if you want a more detailed webinar on sports drinks, because it's a very confusing topic, I'm sure, and I will definitely get a webinar out, certainly if people actually want to see that as well. Our goals for pre-exercise, very simple: provide energy to the working muscles. We want to make sure, sorry, 1 second. Provide energy to the working muscles. We just want to make sure, like I said, that we have enough fuel to last throughout the game. We don't want to hit that wall, our endurance wall. Maximize carbohydrate stores. Again, like I said, there is a rate that they can run out. It's not like fat. You need to make sure they're topped up to the maximum. We don't want to be too hungry during play. We don't want to. We just don't want to. We just want to make sure that we're not hungry during play. Maximize hydration. Make sure that, like I said, we're drinking throughout the day and making sure that's on point. It's all individual. Mentioned it a million times. Just make sure we've got to try and find what works for you. Pre-exercise guidelines. So this is kind of an idea, again, just a guide. So try not to eat massive meals on the day of the game or before practices. Meals should be sort of 2 or 2/3 normal size, especially if it's getting closer towards competition. Meals 3 or 4 hours before, it would be your bigger meal. Snacks would then be 1 or 2 hours before competition. And most people are fine closer to competition. Just rely on liquids and smaller snacks rather than the big meals. I personally have always preferred to take in easier to absorb things right before competition. Recovery aspect, very important, defined here as helping athletes bounce back for future exercise bouts. What we want to consider is just the intensity of exercise. How hard is the practice session? Is an intense game? Do we have exercise? Do we have another game after? Is it a tournament weekend? All these things affect how much we need to drink, how much we need to eat, how much we need to rest, and we just need to make sure that we kind of testing things out and see what works for our child. And it's kind of a trial and error process. Like I said, it's we just need to make sure we're trying these things. The goals for the recovery process is just restore glycogen. So again, carbohydrates after workout to restore the glycogen. There, fluid and electrolyte replacement. Again, sweat is lost in an abundance, especially in hot climates. Let's just make sure we're drinking to replace the minerals that we have lost. And muscle repair and adaptation. Muscle will break down during performance, during activity. We just need to make sure we're taking in protein there as the main source of fuel to help aid in that recovery. Resources on the right there is resources that are available to the club that I've already created, just game day snack ideas, game day nutrition ideas. So those are available to you and goes into a bit more detail on just the types of meals we can eat and the types of carbohydrates and protein sources and things like that. This was the first of many webinars. We will do workshops as well, and nutrition coaching as well. If anybody's interested in that, reach out. We can do individual or team-based coaching. My email there at the bottom. Very happy to answer questions at any point. As I said, if you do see me at the field and you want to ask me anything, go for it. Unless I'm running, because I'm probably getting to another game at that point. But no, feel free to grab me anytime you wish. And that's it for me. I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll send it back over to Rick. Apologies for the pause in the thing. My phone kept going off, and I was trying to turn it off. I thought it on do not disturb mode, but anyways.
Thanks, Gavin. That's great stuff. Yeah, thanks everyone for being on. One thing before we go, I wanted to mention is if there's a particular topic that you want myself or Gavin to hit throughout the season, just shoot those on an email to us, and then we'll try and target those specific areas that are relevant to you. So we want to make sure we're targeting all those areas that really make sense to you and are going to have an impact on your players, on your team. So wanted to end with that, but yeah, really appreciate everyone's time, and we look forward to the next one. Thanks, Gav. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, boss. Thank you, guys.